The macro picture, a navy built from nothing, facing a treasury with nothing left. To understand the scale of what was about to be dismantled, the picture first has to widen to the full extent of what Britain had built. The motor torpedo boat force had been, in essence, the Royal Navy's great wartime improvisation, a fleet constructed almost from scratch after 1939, expanding to more than 900 motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats and coastal forces craft by 1945, based at over 40 operational stations, stretching from Felixstowe and Dover in home waters to Malta, Alexandria, Freetown and Trincomalee across 3 theatres of war. These were fast, cheap, expendable wooden-hulled vessels, typically 30 to 100 tons, capable of 35 to 42 knots, built in dozens of classes by yards including Vosper, Fairmile and, under Lend-Lease, the American Higgins yards. Their tactical niche was narrow and specific: strike enemy shipping at night in confined coastal waters, then vanish before destroyers could respond. It was a role coastal forces crews had performed with real distinction across the North Sea, the English Channel, and the Adriatic. But the war that had justified building this fleet ended on the 8th of May, 1945, and the economic reality waiting on the other side of victory was brutal. Britain in 1945 was, in practical terms, bankrupt. The end of Lend-Lease that August triggered an immediate financial crisis, and the Treasury pressed the Admiralty hard to cut naval expenditure as rapidly as possible. A fleet of small wooden craft that consumed vast quantities of high-octane aviation fuel demanded constant specialist maintenance and existed to perform a tactical role, close-in night action against enemy convoys that no longer had an enemy to act against, was, in the language of peacetime accounting, a liability rather than an asset. The disbandment that followed would become one of the most sweeping reductions in the history of British naval power. The micro picture: one boat, one survey, one verdict zoom from that macro budget crisis down to a single vessel on a single afternoon. And the mechanism of the purge becomes concrete. Admiralty surveyors moving through Britain's harbours in late 1945 found condition varying enormously from hull to hull. Some of the newer Fairmile D craft, the so-called dog boats, roughly 90 tons, the largest and most capable MTBs in Royal Navy service, had been built to higher specifications and had benefited from wartime improvements to their Packard marine engines. These were in relatively sound repair. Others, particularly the older 70-foot Vosper boats that had served continuously since 1940, told a different story. 5 years of hard night operations had worked saltwater deep into every joint of their mahogany and double diagonal planking. Surveyors opening up frame sections on these older hulls routinely found rot that would have made repair uneconomical, even without wartime austerity forcing the question. Each survey report, boat by boat, fed into the same 3-way sorting the Admiralty had already decided on in principle: retain, transfer abroad or scrap. The retention numbers, when they came, were stark by design. The post-war Navy needed only a token coastal forces capability for training and limited experimental work. Somewhere between 50 and 60 hulls, mostly dogboats and other late-war craft, were selected to continue in service, laid up in reserve at Hythe in Hampshire and Pembroke Dock in Wales. Even most of these would themselves be sold or scrapped within a decade. A handful were converted to target vessels and range safety boats. Unglamorous work, but work that bought a few of these boats several more years of life. Friction of war continued into peace, the transfer program's hidden complexity. The transfer program looked, on paper, like the tidiest of the 3 outcomes: simply hand serviceable boats to Allied and friendly navies and let the fleet live on under other flags. In practice, it revealed its own friction. 14 foreign navies eventually received British-built MTBs. Denmark took 12 boats between 1945 and 1947, refitting them at Copenhagen to form the backbone of its coastal defence force into the early 1950s. Norway, which had crewed British MTBs under British command during the war, received 8 further boats to rebuild its own coastal forces arm. The Netherlands took 6, Finland 4, and Greece, its own navy gutted by German occupation, received 10 craft that restored immediate operational capability at modest cost. Further afield, matters grew more tangled. Israel's nascent navy acquired several ex-Royal Navy MTBs in 1948 amid the diplomatic complications of the War of Independence, involving private intermediaries operating in the grey zone between official transfer and improvised acquisition. Burma received 4 boats as part of broader Commonwealth assistance. Thailand acquired 3 Fairmile-type craft. A small number reached the Republic of China before the collapse of the mainland position closed that channel entirely. In total, somewhere between 90 and 110 hulls left British service this way, though the Admiralty's own post-war records, tangled by boats that had already been transferred, sunk or written off mid-war, make an exact figure impossible to reconstruct with confidence even now. The disposal program. Engines first, then the timber, then nothing, for the several hundred boats that were neither retained nor transferred. The fate was considerably less distinguished. The Admiralty's sales branch initially found real civilian demand. Britain's coastal trade, fishing fleets and pleasure boat industry had all been starved of fast, seaworthy craft by the war, and private buyers queued for the chance to convert former fighting boats into yachts and charter vessels. A handful succeeded, particularly among the larger, more comfortable Fairmile B motor launches. Most did not. The Packard 4M 2500 engines that powered most Royal Navy MTBs were extraordinary machines, 1,500 horsepower apiece, but a standard dogboat running 3 of them at full power burned roughly 300 gallons of aviation-grade fuel an hour. Without the Admiralty absorbing that cost, the economics of running these boats in peacetime collapsed almost immediately. The specialist mechanics who had kept the engines running had returned to civilian trades. Parts grew scarce. By 1948, many boats sold to private buyers were already drifting back onto the market or simply abandoned, settling slowly into the mud of estuaries along the Medway, the Thames, and the South Coast, wrecks that would remain as landmarks for local boatmen for decades. For boats that were not sold, the process was more direct. Scrapping was carried out at Faslane on the Clyde, at Devonport in Plymouth, and at private breaking yards along the South Coast. Engines and reusable fittings came out first. The wooden hulls were then broken apart. The timber sold into a post-war Britain desperately short of construction material, the remainder burned or buried. Brass, copper and propeller shafts were melted down for raw metal. By 1950, approximately 650 hulls had gone through this process. Nothing was kept back. No plaques, no preserved examples, no attempt to document individual service histories. The wholesale erasure reflected a broader post-war attitude in which naval preservation had almost no institutional home. The Imperial War Museum, founded after the First World War, lacked both resources and storage space for large watercraft. The National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, opened only in 1937, was similarly constrained. Officials and the public alike were focused on the practical work of reconstruction, not the memorialization of small wooden warships that had, by 1946, already been mentally filed away as obsolete. Debriefing. Why the fleet vanished. So completely analyzed as a policy decision rather than a tragedy, 4 factors explain both the speed and the thoroughness of the purge. First, the fleet's greatest wartime strength, cheap, expendable, purpose-built wooden construction, became its greatest peacetime liability. A vessel designed to be sacrificed in combat carried no institutional expectation of long-term preservation once the combat ended. Second, the tactical niche these boats filled was so specific to wartime conditions that it evaporated overnight with the German surrender. Unlike a cruiser or a destroyer, which retained a general-purpose role in peacetime fleets, a close-in night-attack torpedo boat had almost no post-war mission to justify its upkeep. Third, Britain's 1945 financial position made this a case of necessity overriding sentiment. A nation facing genuine bankruptcy could not subsidize hundreds of fuel-hungry wooden hulls for nostalgic or ceremonial reasons, whatever their wartime record. Fourth, the absence of institutional preservation capacity at the moment of decision meant that even boats worth saving on historical merit had nowhere to go. The preservation movement that later saved aircraft and larger warships simply did not yet exist in any organized form in 1945 and 1946. What survived, A handful of hulls like the Vosper-built MTB-102, painstakingly restored decades later, represents not the fleet's true scale, but the rare exception to a policy that was, in its own time, entirely rational and almost completely final. The men who crewed these boats, many barely out of their teens, fought one of the most intense and least commemorated campaigns of the naval war. The boats that carried them into that fight were, within 5 years of victory, reduced to timber for post-war housing and brass for post-war foundries, and a fleet that once numbered in the thousands survives today as little more than a handful of hulls and a great deal of paperwork.